Blood. That's all Sarah Chen could see as she pressed her hands against the gaping wound in her abdomen, crimson seeping between her fingers like spilled wine on white fabric. The parking garage's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting sickly shadows that danced with her vision as shock began to set in. "Ma'am, stay with me." The security guard's voice seemed to come from underwater, distant and distorted. "EMTs are on their way." 6 hours earlier, Sarah had been doing what she'd done every day for the past 8 years, saving lives at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. The emergency room had been typically chaotic that Tuesday evening. 3 soldiers flown in from deployment, 2 with shrapnel wounds, 1 with a traumatic brain injury that had the neurosurgery team racing against time. Sarah Chen wasn't supposed to be a hero. At 34, she was just another veteran ER nurse with tired eyes and steady hands, the kind of woman who could start an IV in a moving ambulance and keep a straight face while delivering bad news to families. She'd chosen military medicine for a reason that lived in a folded flag on her mantelpiece. Her younger brother Marcus, killed by an IED in Afghanistan 3 years into his Marine deployment. "Every soldier I save is Marcus coming home," she'd told her mother once, during one of Elena Chen's weekly phone calls, urging her daughter to find a safer job. But tonight, Sarah's quiet dedication to honoring her brother's memory would nearly cost her everything. The attack happened at 11:47 p.m. in the hospital's underground parking garage, level B2, where the emergency staff parked after their shifts. Sarah had just finished a brutal double covering for 2 nurses who'd called in sick, and her feet ached in her sensible white shoes as she walked toward her 10-year-old Honda Civic. The sound of scuffling footsteps echoed from behind the concrete pillar marked B24. Sarah paused, keys halfway to her car door. Living in D.C., she knew better than to investigate strange noises, but something about the muffled voices made her hesitate. "Please, I don't have any cash." The voice was educated, desperate. "This isn't about money, Colonel." The response was cold, professional. Sarah's blood went cold. She recognized military bearing when she heard it both in the victim and the predators. This wasn't a random mugging. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Sarah crept toward the sound, her phone already dialing 911. What she saw around the pillar would replay in her nightmares for months. 3 men in dark clothing had cornered a tall man in a navy dress blue uniform. Even in the dim lighting, Sarah could see the silver oak leaves on his collar, Lieutenant Colonel. The victim was pressed against a concrete wall, briefcase clutched to his chest like a shield. "The Morrison case ends tonight," one of the attackers said, pulling out what Sarah's Marine brother would have called a Ka-Bar knife, 7 inches of military-grade steel designed to kill efficiently. "Along with you." That's when Sarah made the choice that would change her life forever. She could have stayed hidden, could have waited for security, for police, for someone else to be the hero. Instead, she thought of Marcus, of every wounded soldier she'd held while they bled out, of the oath she'd taken to do no harm and charged. "Hey!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, sprinting toward the group. "Security! Security!" The first attacker spun toward her, knife already in motion. The blade was aimed at the colonel's heart, but Sarah's body intercepted it, the steel sliding between her shoulder blade and collarbone with a wet, sucking sound that she felt more than heard. The pain was immediate and consuming, like being struck by lightning made of ice. But Sarah had been stabbed before a psychiatric patient during her residency, and she knew she could fight through it for at least 30 seconds, maybe a minute. That might be enough. She tackled the primary attacker, her 120 pounds of fury and adrenaline catching the larger man off guard. They went down together, and she felt the second stab wound as his knife found her abdomen, just below her ribcage. This one was deeper, more dangerous, and she could taste copper in her mouth as internal bleeding began. "Run!" she gasped to the colonel, who was staring at her in shock. "Call for help!" The colonel. Sarah could see his nameplate now. Morrison fumbled for his phone, while the other 2 attackers tried to pull her off their companion. Sarah wrapped her arms around the knife man's waist, clinging like a limpet, using her body weight to keep him pinned. The third stab came from behind, sliding between her ribs as one of the other attackers tried to force her to release their leader. Sarah's grip loosened involuntarily, her body's autonomy overriding her will as blood loss began affecting her coordination. "Security?" Morrison's voice echoed through the garage. "Level B2, officer down." The attackers were professionals, but they weren't prepared for a civilian willing to die to protect their target. As garage security finally arrived, the fourth and final stab caught Sarah in the thigh as the primary attacker tried to break free. "Go, go, go!" the leader hissed, and all 3 men melted into the shadows between parked cars, disappearing into the maze of the underground garage. Sarah collapsed onto the cold concrete, her nursing training automatically cataloging her injuries even as her vision grayed at the edges. Shoulder wound painful, but not life-threatening. Abdominal wound potentially serious, needed immediate surgery. Back wound missed the lung, probably hit muscle. Thigh wound arterial bleeding, needed pressure immediately. She pressed her hands against the abdominal wound, applying pressure the way she'd been taught, and looked up at Morrison, who was kneeling beside her. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Morrison stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. You just took 4 knives for me? Are you okay?" "I'm a nurse," Sarah managed, her voice growing weaker. "It's what we do." Security guards arrived first, followed by hospital security, then EMTs who Sarah knew by name. As they worked to stabilize her, Sarah heard Morrison trying to explain to a security supervisor what had happened. "This wasn't a mugging," Morrison insisted. "They knew my name, my case number. They were there to kill me." The security supervisor, a heavy-set man named Jenkins whom Sarah had seen around the hospital, looked skeptical. "Sir, you're in shock. These things happen in parking garages. Random violence." "Random?" Morrison's voice rose. "They knew I was prosecuting the Aegis defense case?" "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down," Jenkins said in the tone of someone who'd decided what he wanted to believe. "We'll investigate thoroughly, but right now it looks like you and the nurse got caught up in a robbery attempt." As the EMTs loaded Sarah onto a stretcher, she managed to catch Morrison's eye. His face was pale but determined, and she could see him memorizing her face, her name tag, everything about this moment. "They can't know what I was working on," he whispered as the stretcher passed him. "This changes everything." Sarah wanted to ask what he meant, but the morphine was kicking in, and the emergency room doors were already opening to receive her. As consciousness faded, she had one last thought. She'd saved a life tonight. Marcus would have been proud. She had no idea that her heroism had just painted a target on her back that would take the highest levels of the U.S. government to remove. In the trauma bay, as Dr. Patricia Kim worked to repair Sarah's internal injuries, Morrison sat in the waiting area, his dress uniform stained with Sarah's blood, his hands shaking as he tried to process what had just happened. He'd been days away from unsealing indictments that would destroy one of the largest defense contractors in the country. Aegis Defense Solutions had been billing the military for services they never provided, equipment they never delivered, protection they never gave. Soldiers had died because of their fraud, and now they'd tried to kill him to stop the case. But Sarah Chen, a nurse who didn't even know his name, had saved his life. Had nearly died to protect a stranger, and a case she knew nothing about. Morrison pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he'd hoped never to use. A secure number that connected directly to the Pentagon, to people who understood that sometimes justice required protection. As Sarah Chen lay unconscious in recovery, breathing steadily through a ventilator, Morrison began making the calls that would eventually bring the Secretary of Defense to Walter Reed. But first, they'd have to survive what Aegis Defense was planning to do to silence them both. The real fight was just beginning. Sarah woke up to the sound of angry voices outside her hospital room. Completely unacceptable liability exposure. "Do you have any idea what our insurance premiums will look like after this?" "The woman saved a man's life, Frank. The woman created $1 million lawsuit waiting to happen. What if she'd been killed? What if the colonel had been killed while she was playing hero? We're a hospital, not a vigilante training ground." Sarah recognized the voices. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the chief medical officer, and Frank Kellerman, the hospital administrator whose primary concern seemed to be the bottom line rather than the Hippocratic Oath. She tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her stitches. The abdominal wound had required 3 hours of surgery to repair, and every breath reminded her of exactly how close she'd come to not waking up at all. "Miss Chen?" A nurse Sarah didn't recognize entered the room, a deliberate choice, she realized. They didn't want her talking to colleagues who might be sympathetic. "I'm Janet. I'll be your nurse today. How are you feeling?" "Like I got stabbed 4 times, Sarah said dryly. "But alive, so that's something." Janet didn't smile. "Dr. Warren would like to speak with you when you're feeling up to it. And Mr. Kellerman from administration." Sarah's stomach tightened, and not from her injuries. In 8 years at Walter Reed, she'd never been called to meet with administration unless someone was in trouble. An hour later, she sat in a wheelchair in Kellerman's office, still wearing a hospital gown because someone had misplaced her clothes. The power dynamic was clear. She was the patient, the problem, the liability. Dr. Warren sat behind Kellerman's desk like a judge, her expression cold and clinical. Kellerman paced behind her, his expensive suit and Harvard MBA making him look more like a corporate raider than a hospital administrator. "Ms. Chen," Dr. Warren began, "we need to discuss what happened last night." "I saved a man's life," Sarah said simply. Kellerman stopped pacing. "You created a liability nightmare. Do you have any idea what happens when our nurse, gets involved in a violent altercation in our parking garage?" "I'd say it depends on whether she saves a life or not. This isn't a joke," Warren snapped. "You stepped completely outside your scope of practice. You endangered yourself, potentially endangered the colonel, and exposed this hospital to massive legal liability." Sarah stared at her. "I'm sorry, what's my scope of practice when I see 3 men about to murder someone?" "Your scope of practice is to call security and let trained professionals handle dangerous situations," Kellerman said, pulling out a folder. "Which brings us to the incident report." He slid a sheet of paper across the desk. Sarah's eyes widened as she read it. "This says I accidentally interfered with a mugging in progress," she said, her voice rising. "It says I panicked and ran toward the danger instead of away from it." "That's the official version of events," Kellerman said. "Less complicated for everyone involved." "Less complicated? 3 professional killers tried to assassinate a JAG officer, and you're calling it a mugging?" Dr. Warren leaned forward. "Ms. Chen, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's common for trauma victims to create elaborate narratives to explain random violence." "I didn't create anything. I know what I heard, what I saw." "You saw 3 muggers attack a victim, and you intervened," Kellerman said firmly. "Heroic but foolish. And now we need to discuss your future here." Sarah felt cold dread settling in her chest. "My future? Your actions last night demonstrated a concerning lack of judgment." Dr. Warren said, reading from another file. "Reckless endangerment of yourself and others, failure to follow proper emergency protocols, creating unnecessary liability for the hospital. I saved a man's life." "You nearly got yourself killed playing hero," Kellerman snapped. "Heroes don't exist in healthcare, Ms. Chen. Only lawsuits waiting to happen." Sarah stared at him. "In 8 years of nursing, through PTSD episodes and drug-seeking patients and grieving families taking their anger out on staff, no one had ever spoken to her like this. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison will back up my version of events," she said quietly. Dr. Warren and Kellerman exchanged a look that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Colonel Morrison is dealing with his own trauma," Dr. Warren said carefully. "His statement is inconsistent with the physical evidence." "What physical evidence?" "No surveillance cameras in that section of the garage," Kellerman said. "No witnesses except you and the colonel. No recovered weapons. The attackers are long gone." Sarah's mind raced. The security guards saw the aftermath of a mugging," Kellerman interrupted. "3 perpetrators fled the scene after robbing you and the colonel. That's what's going in the police report." The room fell silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. Sarah realized she was looking at a cover-up in real time. "Why?" she whispered. Dr. Warren's expression softened slightly, almost pityingly. "Sarah, you've been working double shifts for months. You've been under tremendous stress since your brother's death. It's possible that your trauma—" "Don't," Sarah's voice was steel. "Don't you dare use Marcus to gaslight me." Kellerman stepped forward. "Ms. Chen, you're on administrative leave pending investigation. We'll provide counseling services and full medical coverage for your injuries. But I strongly suggest you accept the official version of events and move on with your life. And if I don't, then we'll have to consider whether someone who demonstrates such poor judgment under stress is suitable for emergency medical care," Dr. Warren said quietly. The threat was clear. Accept the lie or lose her career. Sarah was still processing this betrayal when Detective Ray Sullivan arrived to take her statement. Sullivan was exactly what Central Casting would order for cynical big city cop. 50s, overweight, with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too much and believed too little. "So, Nurse Chen," Sullivan said, settling his bulk into a chair and pulling out a notebook that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1990s. "Tell me about this mugging." "It wasn't a mugging." Sullivan looked up from his notebook. "Come again?" 3 professional killers tried to assassinate Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. They knew his name, they knew about his case. "Lady, I've been working violent crime for 20 years. You know what I see when I look at this? I see a nurse who watches too much TV, got caught up in a random mugging, and now thinks she's living in some kind of military thriller." Sarah felt her temper flare. "Did you talk to Morrison?" "I talked to a traumatized military lawyer who was mugged in a parking garage, Sullivan said. His story keeps changing. First it was random, then it was targeted, now he's claiming some big conspiracy. Classic trauma response. So you're not investigating the connection to his case? Sullivan closed his notebook. Ms. Chen, here's some free advice from someone who's seen every kind of violence this city has to offer. Not everything's a conspiracy. Sometimes bad things happen to good people for no reason at all. 3 guys tried to rob you and the colonel. You fought back, you got hurt, they ran away. End of story. But, end of story, Sullivan repeated firmly. Now, do you want to press charges for assault and attempted robbery? Or do you want to keep spinning fantasies about government assassins? Sarah stared at him. You're not going to investigate this properly, are you? I'm going to investigate a mugging that happened in a hospital parking garage, Sullivan said, standing up. Because that's what happened. After he left, Sarah sat alone in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed with text messages from colleagues who'd heard about the mugging, offering support and sympathy. The local news had picked up the story. Nurse injured in hospital parking garage mugging. The coverage made her want to scream. She wasn't an unlucky bystander. She'd made a choice to save a life, to risk everything for a stranger. But according to every authority figure she'd encountered, that choice was either reckless stupidity or trauma-induced fantasy. Her mother called that afternoon, having seen the news. Sarah, mihija, are you all right? Elena Chen's voice was tight with worry. The news said you were stabbed. I'm okay, Mom, really. What were you thinking, getting involved? Why didn't you just run away? Sarah closed her eyes. Even her mother, the woman who'd fled Vietnam and built a life in America through sheer determination, didn't understand. Because it was the right thing to do. The right thing is to come home alive to your family, Elena said sharply. The right thing is not to throw your life away for a stranger. After her mother hung up, Sarah called Morrison's number, which she'd gotten from the hospital directory. It went straight to voicemail. Colonel Morrison, this is Sarah Chen, the nurse from last night. I need to talk to you about what really happened. They're trying to make this go away, but we both know the truth. Please call me back. He never did. That evening, her supervisor, nurse manager Patricia Hawkins, came by with flowers and a forced smile. How are you feeling, Sarah? Like I've entered an alternate reality where saving someone's life is considered a mental health crisis. Patricia's smile faltered. Sarah, I know this is frustrating, but you need to think about your career. Mr. Kellerman is concerned about your judgment. My judgment in saving a man's life? Your judgment in creating a liability situation for the hospital? Patricia said quietly. Look, between you and me, just sign the incident report. Accept the counseling. Let this blow over. In 6 months, everyone will forget this ever happened. Sarah looked at her supervisor, a woman she'd respected for 8 years, and realized that Patricia was more afraid of Kellerman than she was committed to the truth. What if I don't? Patricia's expression grew pained. Then I can't protect you. And Frank Kellerman isn't known for his forgiveness. After Patricia left, Sarah lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the hospital around her. Somewhere in the building, wounded soldiers were fighting for their lives, trusting that the medical staff would do everything possible to save them. But the same institution that saved lives was now trying to erase hers, to reduce her moment of courage to a footnote in an incident report. They wanted her to disappear, to accept their version of reality, to pretend that she hadn't seen what she'd seen. Sarah thought about Marcus, about the flag on her mantelpiece, about every soldier she'd held as they died. She thought about Morrison, wherever he was, and whether he was facing the same pressure to forget, to move on, to let sleeping dogs lie. Then she thought about the 3 men who'd tried to kill him and who were still out there. If the hospital wouldn't investigate, if the police wouldn't investigate, if Morrison was being silenced, then she was the only person left who knew the truth. Sarah Chen had always been good at her job because she never gave up on patients, even when the situation seemed hopeless. She wasn't about to start giving up now, but she had no idea how powerful the forces working against her really were, or how far they were willing to go to keep their secrets buried. Morrison found her 3 days later. Sarah had been discharged from Walter Reed against medical advice. Dr. Warren had made it clear that the hospital's support came with strings attached, and Sarah wasn't willing to be anyone's puppet. She was staying in a cheap motel near the hospital, paying with her emergency credit card and trying to figure out her next move. The knock on her door came at 2 a.m. Miss Chen? It's Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. Sarah opened the door to find Morrison looking like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. His usually crisp military bearing was disheveled, his eyes were bloodshot, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. They're watching my apartment, he said without preamble. And my office. And probably my phone. We need to talk. Sarah let him in, noting how he carefully checked the locks and pulled the curtains closed before sitting down. I got your voicemail, he said. I couldn't call back. They're monitoring everything. Who is they? Morrison rubbed his face with both hands. Aegis Defense Solutions. The defense contractor I was prosecuting. The people who tried to kill me. Sarah felt a chill of vindication. So it wasn't a mugging? God, no. Those were professionals. Military trained, probably ex-special forces. The kind of people Aegis Defense uses for security consulting. Morrison pulled out a manila folder, glancing nervously at the window. I need you to understand what you saved, what you risked your life for. He spread documents across the motel room's small table. Sarah saw financial records, military contracts, correspondence marked classified. Aegis Defense Solutions, Morrison began, his voice low and urgent. They're one of the largest private military contractors in the world. Billion-dollar Pentagon contracts for everything from base security to convoy protection to training foreign militaries. Sarah studied the documents. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts spanning multiple years. They've been defrauding the U.S. military for over 5 years, Morrison continued, billing for services they never provided, equipment they never delivered, personnel who didn't exist, ghost soldiers, phantom convoys, imaginary training programs. How much money are we talking about? $2.3 billion. And that's just what we've been able to prove. Sarah's head reeled. That's an enormous amount of money. It's enough to buy a lot of influence. Congressmen, Pentagon officials, judges, and it's enough to kill for. Morrison pulled out a photograph of a distinguished man in his 60s wearing an expensive suit. Marcus Blackstone, CEO and founder of Aegis Defense. Former Deputy Secretary of Defense under 3 administrations. Has friends in every intelligence agency and military command in the country. Sarah studied the photo. Blackstone looked like someone's grandfather, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. It was hard to imagine him ordering assassinations. He built Aegis Defense using contacts he made during his government service, Morrison explained. Military officers he'd promoted, politicians he'd supported, contractors he'd approved. When he left government, they all became his customers. And he's been stealing from them? Stealing from the American taxpayer. But more than that, he's been getting soldiers killed. Morrison pulled out another set of documents, these marked with unit designations and casualty reports. 3 months ago, a Marine unit in Syria was supposed to have Aegis Defense convoy protection. The company billed the Pentagon for 12 armed vehicles and 48 security personnel. Sarah looked at the reports, her nursing experience making the casualty lists all too clear. They sent 4 vehicles and 12 men, Morrison continued, his voice thick with anger. All of them undertrained and under-equipped. When the convoy was attacked, 8 Marines died who should have been protected. Sarah thought of Marcus, of all the soldiers she'd treated, of the families she'd comforted. That's murder. That's business, according to Blackstone. The Pentagon pays for A-level security, Aegis Defense provides C-level protection, and they pocket the difference. If soldiers die because of it. Morrison shrugged bitterly. The cost of doing business? Sarah stared at the documents, understanding for the first time exactly what she'd stumbled into. How long have you been investigating them? 18 months. It started with a whistleblower, a former Aegis Defense accountant who couldn't live with what he'd seen. He brought me financial records, contracts, evidence of systematic fraud. Where is he now? Morrison's expression darkened. Dead. Car accident 3 weeks after he came forward. Very convenient timing. Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. And you think? I think Aegis Defense has been eliminating witnesses for over a year. The accountant, a Pentagon auditor who asked too many questions, a journalist who was investigating defense contractor fraud. Morrison showed her newspaper clippings, obituaries, accident reports. A pattern emerged. People who threatened Aegis Defense's operations had a disturbing tendency to meet untimely ends. I was supposed to be next, Morrison said quietly. I was 3 days away from unsealing the indictments. $2.3 billion in fraud, 16 counts of conspiracy, multiple homicide charges. It would have destroyed them. Was? Morrison's laugh was bitter. My commanding officer, Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, called me yesterday. She's reassigning me to a staff position in Alaska. The Aegis Defense case is being transferred to another prosecutor. Sarah stared at him. They got to your boss? Hayes has been angling for a Pentagon appointment for years. Blackstone has friends who could make that happen, or kill it permanently. Morrison rubbed his temples. She told me the case was too sensitive for a junior officer to handle. Can't you go to someone higher up? Like who? Half the Pentagon has done business with Blackstone. The other half wants to. The Senate Armed Services Committee includes 3 senators who've received major campaign contributions from Aegis Defense. Morrison gathered up the documents, his movements sharp with frustration. That's why they tried to kill me in that parking garage. They knew I couldn't be bought, couldn't be transferred fast enough. So they decided to eliminate the problem permanently. Sarah thought about the 3 men, their professional competence, their knowledge of Morrison's name and case, and I ruined their plan. You saved my life, and probably saved this case, if I can figure out how to keep it alive. What about the new prosecutor? Morrison's expression was grim. Major Linda Walsh, fresh out of law school, no experience with complex financial crimes, and coincidentally, her father works for a lobbying firm that represents defense contractors. So the fix is in. The fix was always in. I was just too naive to realize it. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the corruption settling around them like fog. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked finally. Because you're the only witness to the assassination attempt who isn't being silenced by the military chain of command. And because, Morrison hesitated, because I think they're going to come after you next. Sarah's blood went cold. What do you mean? Morrison showed her a final document, a hospital record request. Someone accessed your military medical records yesterday, not through official channels, through a private intelligence firm that specializes in background investigations. Sarah recognized the name on the request. Blackstone Consulting Services. That's Aegis Defense's intelligence arm. They're building a profile on you, looking for leverage, psychological issues, financial problems, family members they can threaten. It's standard operating procedure for eliminating inconvenient witnesses. As if on cue, Sarah's phone rang. The number was blocked. She answered hesitantly. Hello? Sarah Chen? The voice was electronically distorted, robotic. You need to stop asking questions about things that don't concern you. Line. Morrison was instantly alert, gesturing for her to keep the caller talking. Who is this? Sarah demanded. Someone who knows where your mother lives in Arlington. Someone who knows she works at the corner grocery store on Wilson Boulevard. Someone who knows she walks home alone every night at 10 p.m. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. If you touch her, that depends entirely on you. Forget about what you think you saw in that parking garage. Accept whatever the hospital tells you happened. Go back to your quiet little life, and everyone stays safe. The line went dead. Morrison was already moving, gathering the documents and shoving them back into his folder. We need to get out of here now. They threatened my mother, which means they know where you are. This place isn't safe anymore. As they hurried out of the motel, Sarah's mind raced. In 3 days, she'd gone from being a respected emergency room nurse to being hunted by a billion-dollar defense contractor with connections throughout the government. Where can we go? She asked as they reached Morrison's car. I know someone who might help, if she's still alive. Morrison drove through the dark D.C. streets, taking a circuitous route and constantly checking his mirrors. After 20 minutes, he pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner in a rundown section of Southeast Washington. Inside, a woman in her 40s sat in a corner booth, nursing coffee and checking her phone. She had the lean build and alert eyes of a soldier, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Jennifer Walsh, Morrison said as they approached. Captain Jennifer Walsh, military journalist and the biggest pain in Aegis Defense's ass. Walsh looked up as they sat down, her expression guarded. David, I was wondering when you'd surface. Jennifer's been investigating Aegis Defense independently, Morrison explained to Sarah. She's the one who told me about the other deaths. Walsh studied Sarah with the intensity of someone accustomed to evaluating sources. So, you're the nurse who took 4 knives for our boy here. I'm the nurse who's about to take a lot more than that if we can't stop these people, Sarah replied. Walsh smiled grimly. I like her. She's got spine. Jennifer, they tried to kill me. They're threatening Sarah's family. And the case is being buried. I know, Walsh said. I also know that Major Linda Walsh, no relation, unfortunately, is the new prosecutor, and she's already talking about plea bargains and sealed settlements. Morrison slumped in his seat. So it's over. Not necessarily, Walsh said, pulling out her own folder. I've been working this story for 2 years. I have sources inside Aegis Defense, contacts in Congress, journalists at major newspapers who are ready to break this wide open. She spread out documents that looked similar to Morrison's, but from different sources. Financial records, personnel files, communications between Aegis Defense executives and Pentagon officials. The problem, Walsh continued, is that I need someone with legal standing to make the accusations, someone who can't be dismissed as a muckraking journalist with an agenda. She looked at Morrison. You're being transferred to Alaska, so you're out. But Sarah frowned. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a nurse. You're the victim of an attempted assassination by Aegis Defense operatives, Walsh corrected. You have standing to file a civil suit, to demand a federal investigation, to testify before Congress. Morrison leaned forward. Jennifer, they'll destroy her. They're already trying to destroy her, Walsh pointed out. The question is whether she fights back or just lets them win. Sarah thought about her conversation with her mother, about the hospital administration's threats, about the anonymous phone call. These people had made it clear that her choices were submission or destruction, but they'd made one mistake. They'd threatened her mother. What would I have to do? Sarah asked. Walsh's smile was sharp as a blade. Make them fight this battle in public, where their money and connections are less useful. File a federal lawsuit, demand congressional hearings, give interviews to every major news outlet in the country. And if they try to kill me, then they'll have to do it on national television, Walsh said, which even Aegis Defense isn't bold enough to attempt. Morrison looked skeptical. Jennifer, you're asking her to paint an even bigger target on her back. David, they already tried to kill her once. The target's already there. The question is whether she uses it to draw them into a fight they can't win. Sarah thought about Marcus, about the soldiers she'd treated, about Lieutenant Colonel Morrison bleeding in a parking garage, while professional killers tried to silence him forever. What's the first step? She asked. Walsh's smile widened. We hold a press conference, tomorrow, and we tell the whole world exactly what Aegis Defense Solutions has been doing with their tax dollars. Morrison shook his head. This is insane. You'll both end up dead. Maybe, Walsh agreed. But at least we'll die fighting instead of hiding. Sarah looked at the documents spread across the diner table, evidence of systematic fraud that had cost soldiers' lives and stolen billions from American taxpayers. She thought about Frank Kellerman's words. Heroes don't exist in healthcare. Maybe not in healthcare, but they existed everywhere else. Let's do it, Sarah said. Sarah's apartment had been ransacked. She discovered this when she returned the next morning to collect clothes and documents for the press conference. The door was still locked, but inside, everything had been systematically searched. Drawers pulled out, cushions sliced open, even her brother Marcus's military awards examined and discarded. They were looking for something specific, Sarah realized. Evidence, documents, anything that might support her version of events. Her laptop was gone, along with her tablet and the backup drive where she kept family photos. But they'd missed her real prize, a small digital recorder she kept in her nursing bag, the one she'd used to document her thoughts immediately after the attack. While the details were still fresh in her memory, Sarah listened to her own voice from 4 nights ago, shaky with pain medication but crystal clear about what she'd witnessed. 3 men, professionally dressed, military bearing. They knew Morrison's name, knew about his case. The leader said, "The Morrison case ends tonight, along with you. This was an assassination attempt, not a mugging." It wasn't much, but it was contemporaneous evidence recorded before anyone had time to coach her or suggest alternative narratives. Her phone rang. Jennifer Walsh. Sarah, we have a problem. Morrison's been arrested. What? On what charges? Theft of classified documents. Apparently, someone reported that he removed sensitive materials from his office without authorization. Sarah's blood ran cold. The documents he showed me, which are now evidence in a federal case against him. If he's convicted, anything he says about Aegis Defense will be dismissed as the ravings of a disgraced former officer trying to reduce his sentence. Sarah sank onto her ruined couch, surrounded by the wreckage of her life. So they got him. They got him off the board temporarily. But Sarah, this actually works in our favor. How? Because now you're the only credible witness left. They can't arrest you, you're the victim. They can't claim you stole classified documents, you're a civilian. You're their worst nightmare. Someone with first-hand knowledge who can't be silenced through official channels. So they'll just kill me. Not if we move fast. I've scheduled the press conference for this afternoon. Major media outlets, congressional representatives, live coverage. Once your story is public, you become too high profile to eliminate quietly. Sarah wasn't convinced. Jennifer, these people have killed before. Yes, but always in ways that looked accidental or unrelated. Car crashes, muggings, heart attacks. They've never had to operate under media scrutiny. The press conference changes the game. After Walsh hung up, Sarah sat in her destroyed apartment, trying to process how quickly her life had collapsed. 4 days ago, she'd been a respected nurse with a quiet life and a clear conscience. Now she was unemployed, potentially homeless, and marked for death by one of the most powerful defense contractors in the country. Her phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed, "Mom, Sarah, Mihija, something terrible has happened." Sarah's heart stopped. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Men came to the grocery store yesterday. They said they were from immigration, that they needed to verify my citizenship status. They had official badges, official papers." Sarah closed her eyes. Aegis Defense was escalating their pressure campaign. "Did they hurt you?" "No, but they made it very clear that my status here depends on certain cooperation." Elena's voice was tight with fear. "Sarah, what have you gotten involved in?" Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She could tell her mother the truth that she'd witnessed an assassination attempt and was now being targeted by a corrupt defense contractor. Or she could protect her mother by keeping her in the dark. "Mom, I need you to visit Aunt Rosa in San Antonio, today." "Sarah, I can't just leave work." "Mom, please, just for a few days. I'll explain everything later, but right now, I need to know you're safe." There was a long pause. "This is about what happened in that parking garage, isn't it? You didn't just interrupt a mugging." Sarah's mother had fled one war-torn country and built a life in America through sheer determination. She understood danger better than most. "Mom, I'll pack a bag," Elena said quietly. "But Sarah, Mihija, be careful. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the thing that gets you killed." After her mother hung up, Sarah began her own research into Aegis Defense. If she was going to destroy her life fighting these people, she wanted to understand exactly what she was up against. What she found online was a carefully constructed facade of corporate respectability. Aegis Defense's website showed smiling soldiers, happy military families, patriotic imagery of American flags and eagles. Their press releases talked about supporting our heroes and bringing our boys home safely. But digging deeper, using skills she'd learned researching medical conditions for difficult cases, Sarah began to find cracks in the facade. Defense contractor message boards where former Aegis employees complained about corner cutting and dangerous practices. Financial reports that showed enormous profits despite relatively modest reported expenses. Personnel records suggesting high turnover rates among field operatives, often explained as training accidents or enemy action. Most disturbing were the casualty reports. Units protected by Aegis Defense suffered casualties at nearly twice the rate of units protected by other contractors. The company explained this as accepting higher risk assignments. But Sarah's medical training made her suspicious of such convenient explanations. She was deep in a Pentagon database of contractor performance metrics when her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw two men in expensive suits standing in her hallway. They looked like Secret Service agents or FBI professional, alert and completely out of place in her modest apartment building. "Ms. Chen, we'd like to speak with you." Sarah didn't open the door. "Who are you?" The taller man held up a badge. "Agent Martinez, FBI. We understand you've been the victim of a violent crime and we'd like to discuss your case." Sarah's heart leaped. Finally, someone taking her seriously. She opened the door and immediately realized her mistake. The badges looked official, but something about the men felt wrong. Too smooth, too polished, like actors playing FBI agents rather than the real thing. "May we come in?" Agent Martinez asked, already stepping forward. "Actually, I'd prefer to talk at FBI headquarters," Sarah said, trying to close the door. The second man's foot blocked it. "Ms. Chen, we're here to help you, but time is of the essence." Sarah's nursing instincts, trained to spot danger in chaotic emergency situations, were screaming warnings. These weren't FBI agents. "I need to see additional identification," she said. "Of course," Martinez said, reaching into his jacket. Instead of credentials, his hand emerged with a syringe. Sarah slammed the door and threw the deadbolt, her heart hammering. She heard muffled conversation in the hallway, then the sound of tools being applied to her locks. She had maybe 30 seconds. Sarah grabbed her purse, the digital recorder, and her brother's service pistol, a Beretta M9 she'd kept but never learned to use properly, and ran for the fire escape. Behind her, she heard her front door opening. The fire escape led to an alley behind her building. Sarah dropped onto the pavement, her healing wounds screaming in protest, and ran toward the street. A black sedan was waiting at the mouth of the alley. Sarah turned and ran the other direction, toward the busy commercial street 2 blocks away. Behind her, she could hear footsteps, voices coordinating in professional shorthand. She made it to the main street and immediately started screaming. "Help! Someone call 911. These men are trying to kidnap me." The response was everything she'd hoped for. Pedestrians stopped, cell phones came out, someone was already dialing emergency services. The fake FBI agents appeared at the mouth of the alley, took one look at the crowd of witnesses, and melted back into the shadows. Sarah collapsed onto the sidewalk, gasping for breath, as real police sirens approached in the distance. An hour later, she sat in the back of Jennifer Walsh's car, still shaking. "They tried to grab me," she said. "Fake FBI agents with a syringe. If I'd let them in, you'd have had a drug overdose or suicide," Walsh said grimly. "Aegis Defense is done playing games. Jennifer, maybe we should call this off. If they're willing to kidnap me in broad daylight, then we're close to something they're desperate to protect," Walsh interrupted. "Sarah, scared money doesn't win. If we back down now, you're dead anyway. The only way out is through." Sarah looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was pale, her hands still trembling, her eyes wild with adrenaline and terror. But she was alive. And she was angry. "What time is the press conference?" she asked. 3:00. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Sarah thought about her mother, forced to flee to another state. About Morrison, arrested on trumped-up charges. About the soldiers who died because Aegis Defense had pocketed their protection money. About Marcus, who died believing he was serving his country, not lining the pockets of corrupt contractors. "I'm ready," she said. The press conference was held at the National Press Club, with Sarah flanked by Walsh and a civil rights attorney who specialized in whistleblower protection. The room was packed with reporters, congressional staffers, and representatives from military advocacy groups. Sarah had never spoken to media before, but her nursing experience had taught her to stay calm under pressure and communicate clearly in crisis situations. She told her story simply and directly. The assassination attempt in the parking garage, the institutional cover-up by hospital administration and police, the threats against her family, the fake FBI agents who'd tried to drug her. Aegis Defense Solutions has committed systematic fraud against the American military, Sarah concluded, looking directly into the cameras. They've stolen billions of dollars that should have protected our soldiers. And when Lieutenant Colonel Morrison tried to prosecute them, they sent killers after him. The questions came fast and sharp. "Miss Chen, Aegis Defense denies any involvement in the attack. How do you respond?" "I know what I heard. They knew Morrison's name, they knew about his case. This wasn't random violence." "What proof do you have of systematic fraud?" "I'm a nurse, not an investigator. But I know that soldiers are dying because they're not getting the protection they're paying for. That's not an accounting error, that's murder." "Are you afraid for your life?" Sarah paused, thinking about the men in her hallway, the syringe, the terror in her mother's voice. "Yes," she said simply, "but I'm more afraid of what happens if we let them win." The press conference dominated the evening news. By midnight, Sarah's story was trending on social media. Congressional representatives were calling for investigations, and Aegis Defense's stock price had dropped 15%. Sarah spent the night in a safe house arranged by Walsh, watching the coverage and waiting for the other shoe to drop. It didn't take long. Her phone rang at 6 a.m. The caller ID showed Walter Reed Hospital. "Ms. Chen, this is Dr. Margaret Stone, Chief of Staff. I'm calling to inform you that your nursing license is under review by the State Medical Board for psychological unfitness to practice." Sarah's blood went cold. "On what grounds? Paranoid delusions, conspiracy theories, behavior consistent with PTSD-induced psychosis. You'll need to undergo comprehensive psychiatric evaluation before you can return to nursing." The call ended before Sarah could respond. Walsh found her an hour later, staring at her phone in numb shock. "They're trying to destroy my career," Sarah said. "Make me look crazy, unreliable." "Sarah, this actually proves we're winning. They wouldn't be this desperate if we weren't hitting them where it hurts." "Winning? I can't practice nursing. I can't go home. My mother's in hiding. Morrison's in jail. How is this winning?" Walsh sat down beside her, her expression serious. "Because tomorrow morning, the Secretary of Defense is going to hold a press conference about defense contractor oversight. Because 3 congressional committees have announced investigations. Because Aegis Defense is fighting for their corporate life instead of planning your murder." Sarah looked at her. "How do you know about the Secretary of Defense?" Walsh smiled for the first time since Sarah had met her. "Because I called him. And it turns out he's been waiting for someone brave enough to start this fight." Secretary of Defense James Mitchell was not a man who made unscheduled visits to military hospitals. In his 3 years at the Pentagon, he'd maintained a rigorous schedule of planned appearances, carefully orchestrated events designed to maximize political impact while minimizing security risks. But at 800 hours on a gray Thursday morning, his motorcade pulled up to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center unannounced, sending hospital administrators into a panic that could be heard 3 floors away. Sarah learned about it from Jennifer Walsh, who'd been monitoring government communications through her network of military contacts. "He's here," Walsh said, bursting into the safe house where Sarah had spent another sleepless night. "Mitchell's at Walter Reed right now, and he's asking specifically for you." Sarah looked up from the morning newspapers, which were full of follow-up stories about her press conference. Aegis Defense's stock had opened down another 12%. 3 senators had called for congressional hearings, and the Pentagon had announced a comprehensive review of defense contractor oversight. "Why would the Secretary of Defense want to see me?" Sarah asked. "Because you just handed him the biggest defense contractor scandal in a decade," Walsh replied. "And because Morrison managed to get a message to him before he was arrested." Sarah frowned. "What kind of message?" Walsh pulled out her phone, showing Sarah a news alert. "Morrison's been released, all charges dropped. Apparently, the classified documents he allegedly stole were legally obtained through proper channels." Sarah felt a surge of relief. At least one good thing had come from this nightmare. "So what does Mitchell want?" "To clean house," Walsh said. "And to use your story to do it." An hour later, Sarah found herself back at Walter Reed for the first time since her discharge. The hospital felt different now, not like the place where she'd worked for 8 years, but like enemy territory. Secretary Mitchell had taken over the hospital's main conference room, and the tension in the building was palpable. Sarah could see nervous administrators huddled in hallways, whispering urgently into phones. Mitchell himself was not what Sarah had expected. She'd seen him on television, of course, but in person, he seemed smaller, older, more human. He wore his dress uniform, but without the parade ground stiffness she associated with high-ranking Pentagon officials. What struck her most were his eyes. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen combat, who understood that real leadership meant making hard decisions that cost lives. "Ms. Chen," he said, standing as she entered the conference room. "Thank you for coming." Also present were Morrison, looking tired but relieved, Jennifer Walsh with her recording equipment, and a woman Sarah didn't recognize, a stern-faced colonel with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "This is Colonel Patricia Hayes," Mitchell said, noting Sarah's confusion. "Brigadier General Hayes, actually, as of this morning. She's Morrison's new commanding officer and the lead prosecutor for the expanded Aegis Defense investigation." Sarah looked at Morrison, who managed a weak smile. Turns out General Hayes wasn't pressured to kill the case. She was ordered by her superiors to slow it down while the Pentagon figured out how deep the corruption went. "How deep did it go?" Sarah asked. Mitchell's expression darkened. "Deep enough that we can't trust normal investigative channels, which is why I needed to hear your story directly from you." For the next hour, Sarah recounted everything. The assassination attempt, the institutional cover-up, the threats against her family, the fake FBI agents. Mitchell listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When she finished, Mitchell sat back in his chair and looked at the others in the room. "Colonel, excuse me, General Hayes, your assessment?" Hayes leaned forward, her voice crisp and professional. "Mr. Secretary, what Miss Chen describes is consistent with everything we've discovered about Aegis Defense's operations. They have a systematic pattern of eliminating threats through violence and intimidation." "And the hospital's response?" "Classic institutional capture. Aegis Defense has financial relationships with board members, and they use that influence to pressure hospital administration into covering up the assassination attempt." Mitchell nodded grimly. "Ms. Chen, I owe you an apology, not just from me personally, but from every part of the system that should have protected you and failed." Sarah felt an unexpected surge of emotion. After days of being dismissed, threatened, and gaslit by authority figures, having the highest-ranking defense official in the country validate her experience was almost overwhelming. "What happens now?" she asked. Mitchell's smile was sharp as a blade. "Now we hold some people accountable." The secretary's first stop was a confrontation with hospital administration that Sarah was allowed to witness from an adjoining room. Through a one-way window, she watched as Dr. Klude, Elizabeth Warren, Administrator Frank Kellerman, and Chief of Staff Dr. Margaret Stone were summoned to explain their actions. "Gentlemen, Dr. Warren," Mitchell began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "I'm here to discuss your handling of the assault on Miss Sarah Chen." Kellerman immediately went into damage control mode. Mr. Secretary, we followed all proper protocols for a violent incident in our facility. You followed protocols for covering up an assassination attempt? Mitchell interrupted. Dr. Warren, you placed Ms. Chen on administrative leave for psychological concerns after she reported being attacked by professional killers. Explain that decision. Doctor, Warren shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Secretary, Ms. Chen's account of events was inconsistent with the physical evidence. We felt she might be suffering from trauma-induced. The physical evidence you mean? Mitchell said, consulting a folder. Is the lack of surveillance footage from cameras that mysteriously malfunctioned that night? Kellerman and Dr. Warren exchanged glances. Mr. Secretary, Kellerman said, we made decisions based on the information available to us at the time. You made decisions based on pressure from Aegis Defense Solutions, Mitchell said flatly. Mr. Kellerman, your wife serves on Aegis Defense's board of directors. Dr. Warren, your research institute has received $2.7 million in grants from Aegis Defense over the past 3 years. Dr. Warren, Stone, your husband's lobbying firm represents defense contractors including Aegis Defense. The room fell silent. Mitchell leaned forward. Did any of you think to mention these financial relationships when you were deciding how to handle an assault on one of your nurses by Aegis Defense operatives? Mr. Secretary, Dr. Warren began, those relationships had no bearing on our professional judgment. Your professional judgment, Mitchell said, his voice rising slightly, was to silence the victim of an assassination attempt and protect the people who tried to kill her. If that's not corruption, it's something worse, cowardice. Sarah watched from the adjoining room as 3 powerful people who'd spent days making her feel small and crazy were reduced to stammering excuses by someone who understood the truth. Mitchell stood, his body language making it clear the meeting was over. Dr. Warren, you're terminated immediately. Mr. Kellerman, you're terminated immediately. Dr. Stone, you're being transferred to a research position with no patient contact and no administrative authority. Mr. Secretary, Kellerman protested, you can't just— Actually, I can. This hospital receives 60% of its funding from the Department of Defense. I can shut you down entirely if I choose to. Consider yourselves lucky that termination is all you're facing. As the 3 disgraced administrators filed out, Mitchell turned toward the one-way window where Sarah was watching. Miss Chen, please join us. Sarah entered the conference room, where Morrison and General Hayes were waiting with Mitchell. I want you to know, Mitchell said, that an FBI task force is being formed to investigate all aspects of Aegis Defense's criminal enterprise. You'll be placed in witness protection until the trials are complete. Sarah felt a mix of relief and sadness. Protection meant safety, but it also meant the end of her life as she'd known it. What about my job? My career? Mitchell's expression softened slightly. Ms. Chen, you'll be reinstated immediately with full honors. Your medical expenses will be covered, your back pay will be provided with interest, and the hospital will issue a public apology for their handling of your case. And my nursing license. The state medical board's investigation has been terminated. It turns out that Dr. Roger Hoffman, who declared you psychologically unfit, has been receiving consulting fees from a firm that does work for Aegis Defense. Sarah shook her head in amazement. How deep does this go? We're still finding out, General Hayes said. But it appears that Aegis Defense has been systematically compromising anyone who might threaten their operations. Hospital administrators, police detectives, prosecutors, doctors, state licensing boards, anyone who could interfere with their ability to silence witnesses. Mitchell pulled out a final folder. Which brings us to the larger picture. Miss Chen, your courage in coming forward has exposed a conspiracy that goes far beyond simple fraud. He spread out documents that looked similar to what Morrison had shown her, but these were marked with the highest classification levels Sarah had ever seen. Aegis Defense has been operating as a private intelligence agency, Mitchell explained, using their government contracts as cover for surveillance, intimidation, and elimination of political targets. Politicians who oppose defense spending, journalists investigating military contracts, whistleblowers from other defense contractors. Sarah stared at the documents. How many people have they killed? We've identified at least 17 suspicious deaths over the past 5 years, General Hayes said. Car accidents, heart attacks, suicides, muggings, all involving people who threatened Aegis Defense's interests. And they would have gotten away with it, Mitchell added, if you hadn't been brave enough to step into that parking garage. Sarah thought about that night, about the choice to run toward danger instead of away from it. I just did what anyone would do. No, Mitchell said firmly. You did what heroes do, and that made all the difference. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt a strange sense of closure. The powerful people who'd tried to destroy her had been brought to account. The system that had failed her was being reformed. Justice, it seemed, was finally being served. But she also felt the weight of what lay ahead. Trials, testimony, years of legal proceedings. Her quiet life as a nurse was over, replaced by something she'd never asked for: the role of a public figure, a symbol of courage against corruption. "Miss Chen," Mitchell said as they prepared to leave, "I know this isn't the life you chose, but sometimes history chooses us instead of the other way around." Sarah thought about Marcus, about the flag on her mantelpiece, about all the soldiers who died because of Aegis Defense's greed. "Mr. Secretary," she said, "if my brother taught me anything, it's that sometimes you have to fight for things bigger than yourself." Mitchell nodded approvingly. "Your brother would be proud." As Sarah left Walter Reed for what might be the last time as an employee, she felt the weight of transformation. She'd entered this building as a victim, dismissed and discredited by the system she'd served faithfully for 8 years. She was leaving as something else entirely: a catalyst for change, a witness to corruption, a woman who'd taken 4 knives to protect a stranger and ended up protecting her country. The real work was just beginning. Outside, Jennifer Walsh was waiting with her camera crew, ready to document the next phase of the story. The media frenzy, the congressional hearings, the trials, all of it lay ahead. But for the first time since that night in the parking garage, Sarah Chen felt like she could breathe freely. The truth was out. The powerful were being held accountable, and justice was finally possible. It had only cost her 4 wounds, and everything she'd thought she'd wanted from life. Looking back, it seemed like a bargain. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood before the Senate Armed Services Committee, her right hand raised, swearing to tell the truth about Aegis Defense Solutions. The hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. C-SPAN carried the proceedings live, and major news networks provided continuous coverage of what had become known as the Aegis Defense Scandal. "Miss Chen," Senator Robert Martinez began, "in your own words, please tell this committee what you witnessed on the night of the attack." Sarah looked out at the sea of faces: senators, journalists, military families, and in the front row, her mother Elena, who had flown in from Texas specifically to watch her daughter testify before Congress. "Senator, I saw 3 professional killers attempt to murder Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison to prevent him from prosecuting a case that would have exposed $2.3 billion in defense contractor fraud." Her voice was steady, confident in a way that would have surprised the Sarah of 6 months ago. That woman had been a quiet nurse who avoided conflict and kept her head down. This woman had learned that sometimes keeping your head down meant letting evil triumph. "And when you intervened," Senator Martinez continued, "you were stabbed 4 times. "Yes, sir. But Colonel Morrison survived. His case proceeded, and Aegis Defense's criminal enterprise was exposed." The hearing had been building toward this moment for weeks. Previous witnesses had included Morrison himself, now promoted to full colonel and leading the Pentagon's new Defense Contractor Oversight Division, General Hayes, whose exposure of corruption in the military justice system had led to widespread reforms, and Jennifer Walsh, whose investigative reporting had won a Pulitzer Prize and sparked congressional action. But Sarah's testimony was the emotional centerpiece, the human face of institutional failure and personal courage. "Miss Chen," Senator Linda Park asked, "what would you say to critics who argue that you should have simply called security instead of intervening personally?" Sarah had been asked this question dozens of times by reporters, defense attorneys, and armchair critics who couldn't understand why someone would risk their life for a stranger. "Senator, I would say that evil triumphs when good people decide that someone else will handle it. Those 3 men weren't going to wait for security to arrive. Colonel Morrison would have been dead, billions in fraud would have remained hidden, and soldiers would have continued dying because of Aegis Defense's greed." She paused, looking directly at the cameras. "My brother Marcus died in Afghanistan believing he was protected by the best equipment and security that American tax dollars could buy. It turns out that Aegis Defense was stealing that money instead. Every soldier I save in the ER is Marcus coming home. I couldn't let them kill the man who was trying to bring his killers to justice." The hearing room fell silent. Sarah could see tears in several senators' eyes, and even the usually cynical press corps seemed moved by her words. Senator Martinez consulted his notes. "Miss Chen, can you tell the committee about the institutional response to your actions?" This was the part Sarah had been dreading, but also the part she felt was most important. Individual corruption was one thing, systematic institutional failure was far worse. "Senator, every authority figure I encountered tried to silence me, discredit me, or intimidate me into accepting a false narrative. Hospital administrators called me delusional. Police detectives dismissed my account as fantasy. Doctors declared me psychologically unfit. Even my nursing license was threatened. Why do you think that happened? Because Aegis Defense had compromised all of them. Through financial relationships, political pressure, or direct intimidation, they had turned the institutions that should have protected me into weapons against me. Senator Park leaned forward. What message do you think this sends to other potential whistleblowers? Sarah considered the question carefully. This was her chance to speak not just about her case, but about the broader principle of standing up to power when it was corrupt. Senator, I think it sends two messages. First, that powerful people will try to destroy you if you threaten their interests. But second, that if you persist, if you refuse to be silenced, eventually the truth comes out. The hearing continued for 3 more hours, with Sarah answering questions about everything from hospital security protocols to defense contractor oversight. When it was finally over, she felt drained but vindicated. Outside the Capitol, she was surrounded by reporters asking for follow-up comments. Sarah had learned to navigate media attention over the past 6 months, though she still preferred treating patients to giving interviews. Ms. Chen, what's next for you? A CNN reporter asked. I'm returning to nursing, Sarah said simply. Walter Reed has offered me my old position back, and I've accepted. Aren't you worried about your safety? Sarah smiled slightly. The people who threatened me are in federal prison awaiting trial. The conspiracy that protected them has been dismantled. I think I'm safer now than I've been in months. The trials had indeed been swift and comprehensive. Marcus Blackstone, CEO of Aegis Defense, had been convicted on 37 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and murder. His sentence of life without parole had sent a clear message to other defense contractors about the consequences of putting profit ahead of soldiers' lives. Helen Vance, the company attorney who'd orchestrated the cover-up campaign, received 25 years for conspiracy and witness intimidation. Tom Rodriguez, the lobbyist who'd threatened Sarah's mother, got 15 years for the same charges. Most satisfying to Sarah were the convictions of the 3 men who'd actually attacked her and Morrison. Enhanced surveillance footage from nearby buildings had eventually identified them as former Special Forces operators who'd been working for Aegis Defense's private security division. All 3 received life sentences for attempted murder and conspiracy. The institutional reforms had been equally sweeping. Secretary Mitchell had implemented new oversight procedures for defense contractors, including mandatory background checks for executives and real-time monitoring of contract performance. The Pentagon's Inspector General had been given expanded authority to investigate contractor fraud, and new protections had been established for military and civilian whistleblowers. At Walter Reed, Sarah's return was marked by the establishment of the Sarah Chen Award for Nursing Courage, recognizing healthcare workers who went above and beyond their professional duties to protect patients or colleagues. Frank Kellerman's replacement as hospital administrator, Dr. Seifeldauer, Michael Rodriguez, had personally apologized to Sarah and implemented new policies, ensuring that staff members would never again face retaliation for reporting criminal activity. Miss Chen, Dr. Rodriguez had said during her reinstatement ceremony, your courage didn't just save Colonel Morrison's life, it saved this institution's soul. But for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came when she returned to the emergency room for her first shift back. The staff who'd watched her transformation from dismissed victim to national hero weren't sure how to treat her. Was she still just Sarah, the reliable nurse who could start an IV in impossible conditions? Or was she now Sarah Chen, the woman who'd testified before Congress and brought down a billion-dollar criminal conspiracy? The answer came during her 3rd hour back, when the EMTs brought in a young Marine with shrapnel wounds from a training accident. As Sarah worked to stabilize his injuries, she heard him whisper to his buddy, "Hey, isn't that the nurse who?" "Yeah," his friend replied. "That's her." The wounded Marine looked up at Sarah with something approaching awe. "Ma'am, my unit was supposed to have Aegis defense support on our last deployment. Because of what you did, we got real protection instead. You probably saved my whole squad." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized the full impact of her choice in that parking garage. It wasn't just about Morrison, or the fraud case, or even the $2 billion in recovered taxpayer money. It was about every soldier who would now receive the protection they'd been promised. Every military family that wouldn't have to grieve for losses caused by corporate greed. "I'm just doing my job," Sarah told the Marine, echoing what she'd said to Morrison that first night. "No, ma'am," the Marine replied. "You did a lot more than that." That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment, now in a secure building with proper security, paid for by the restitution fund from Aegis Defense's bankruptcy proceedings. On her mantelpiece, next to Marcus's folded flag, sat a new addition, a medal from the Secretary of Defense recognizing her extraordinary courage in the face of institutional corruption. Her mother called as she was making dinner. "Mija, I watched the hearing today. I was so proud." "Thanks, Mom. I know this wasn't what you wanted for me." Elena's laugh was warm and slightly sad. "Sarah, when I came to this country, it was because I believed in the idea of America, that individuals could stand up to power, that truth could triumph over corruption, that one person could make a difference." She paused. "I spent so many years trying to keep you safe, trying to keep you quiet, that I almost forgot why I came here in the first place. You reminded me. Mom, you are what I came to America to become. You are what Marcus died to protect. You are why this country is worth believing in." After they hung up, Sarah sat in her living room, thinking about the path that had brought her here. 6 months ago, she'd been an anonymous nurse living a quiet life, content to honor her brother's memory by saving other people's brothers and sisters. Now she was a public figure, a symbol of resistance to corruption, a woman whose story would be told in military academies and nursing schools for generations to come. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but as she looked at Marcus's flag and thought about all the soldiers who were alive because Aegis Defense could no longer steal their protection money, she realized it was exactly the life she was meant to live. The next morning, Sarah reported for duty in the Walter Reed emergency room. There would be other cases, other patients, other opportunities to save lives. The work would continue. But now she knew something she hadn't understood before. Sometimes saving one life means saving thousands. Sometimes the right choice in one moment can change everything that comes after. Sometimes heroes aren't born, they're just ordinary people who refuse to walk away when walking away would be easier. Sarah Chen had learned to be a hero the hard way. But looking back at the 4 scars on her body and the lives that had been saved because of them, she wouldn't change a thing. The real victory wasn't that she'd survived, it was that the truth had survived with her. And in the end, that made all the difference. The end.